Hello, good evening. I think you've had a wonderful day and deserve some time to relax. Now we have two stories. The first is about a journey to Jupiter, and the second is about a beautiful call for help in a language they've never seen. I'd appreciate it if you'd like and comment on the stories and tell me which country you're listening to me from. So, let's get right to it. Sleep tight. There were so many galaxies, suns, planets, meteors in the void of space, but there were still voids. Without light, everywhere was dark. The silver vessel Whisper drifted through the cosmic void like a sleeping bird, her hull gleaming with the soft light of distant stars. Thomas stood at the observation deck, his weathered hands pressed against the cool glass, watching the great sphere of Jupiter grow larger with each passing hour. The planet's bands of amber and rust swirled in endless patterns, hypnotic and ancient, each stripe a river of atmosphere deeper than any ocean on Earth. "She's beautiful," Goldie whispered beside him, her voice carrying the warmth that had sustained them through countless journeys across the void. Her golden hair caught the planet's reflected light, creating small halos that danced as she moved her head, each strand seeming to capture and hold starlight, like precious metal spun into silk, like a marble painted by gods who had eternity to perfect their craft. Thomas nodded slowly, his grey eyes that had seen nebulae birth stars and watched black holes devour light itself, fixed on the massive world before them. "Beautiful and dangerous," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the deep respect that came from 7 years of wandering the galaxy's more treacherous reaches. "The storms down there have raged for centuries, some larger than our entire home world, spinning in patterns that predate human civilization." The Whisper had been their companion for those 7 years, a craft built for silence and grace rather than brute speed or overwhelming power. Her engines hummed with the gentleness of a cat's purr, barely audible even in the ship's quiet corridors during the deep space watches, when the universe seemed to hold its breath. She was small enough for 2 souls to call home, large enough for dreams, and the equipment needed to chase them across the galaxy's spiral arms. Every surface of the ship bore the subtle wear of long voyaging, the gentle rounding of edges touched by countless hands, the soft polish that came from years of careful maintenance, the 1,000 tiny modifications that had been made during their travels, a handrail smoothed by Goldie's touch during particularly rough passages through asteroid fields, a display screen that Thomas had angled precisely to catch the light just so during his morning observations. These were the marks of a ship that was not merely a tool but a home, a third member of their partnership in exploration. "The atmospheric probe is ready," Goldie reported, checking the instruments with practiced ease. Her fingers moved like a pianist's across the controls, each touch deliberate and sure, informed by years of experience with systems that had to work perfectly or leave them stranded in the void. "The descent capsule will protect us through the outer layers. All the seals are intact. The pressure compensation is calibrated for Jupiter's specific atmospheric composition." She paused in her work, running through the checklist one more time. It was a ritual they had developed over the years, not from lack of confidence in their abilities, but from understanding that space forgave no shortcuts, overlooked no details. Every system had to be perfect, every contingency planned for, every backup tested and ready. Thomas turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. They had explored nebulae that sang in colors beyond naming, their gases forming natural symphonies of light that could be heard through radio telescopes. They had walked through asteroid gardens, where crystal flowers bloomed in hard vacuum, sustained by solar radiation and magnetic fields, creating impossible beauty in the emptiness between worlds. They had danced with comet spirits in the outer reaches of solar systems, beings of ice and ancient memory, who remembered the formation of planets. But Jupiter was different, ancient beyond measure, powerful in ways that made other celestial bodies seem fragile as soap bubbles. A world of layers within layers, secrets within secrets, mysteries that had confounded astronomers for centuries, and would likely confound them for centuries more. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, not from fear. Thomas had long ago learned to transform fear into respect and caution, but from the careful consideration that had kept them alive through 7 years of wandering the galaxy's more dangerous reaches. "Once we enter her atmosphere, there's no turning back until we reach the other side. The pressure gradients, the electromagnetic fields, the sheer scale of the weather systems will be committed to a path we can't fully predict." Goldie smiled, that radiant expression that could warm the coldest void between galaxies, light up the darkest nebula. "Thomas, when have we ever chosen the safe path?" Her eyes sparkled with the mischief that had first drawn him to her, back in the days when they had been separate souls dreaming of stars from the surface of a world that suddenly seemed too small for their shared vision. "Besides," she added, her voice taking on that particular tone of wonder that meant she was already imagining the discoveries ahead, "I've always wondered what lies beneath those clouds, what songs the deep storms sing, what forms life might take in a world where the very concept of solid ground is meaningless." The preparation took an hour and a half, their movements synchronized through years of partnership that had taught them to work as smoothly as a single mind in 2 bodies. They sealed the Whisper within her protective shell, a cocoon of advanced materials that would shield them from the crushing pressures below, layers of compressed carbon stronger than diamond, fields of electromagnetic force that could deflect charged particles, thermal regulators that could maintain comfortable temperatures even in the heart of a gas giant. The descent would be gentle, controlled, like sinking into warm honey that grew denser with depth. Every meter would be monitored, every system checked and rechecked. They had learned long ago that the universe rewarded patience and punished haste with equal measure. As they worked, Thomas found his mind drifting to their first meeting, 7 years, and what seemed like a lifetime ago. He had been a scholar of astronomical phenomena, content to study the universe from a safe distance through telescopes and mathematical models. Goldie had been a pilot and explorer, her ship small and fast, her hunger for direct experience burning like a star in her eyes. "The universe is too beautiful to see only through instruments," she had told him on their first night together among the stars. "It needs to be touched, breathed, experienced with every sense we possess." She had been right, of course. 7 years of wandering had taught them both that the universe was not merely a collection of objects moving through space, but a living thing, conscious in ways that defied easy understanding, responsive to the intentions and dreams of those brave enough to venture into its depths. Jupiter's gravity began to take hold of them, invisible hands reaching across the void to embrace their small craft. The sensation was subtle at first, just a slight adjustment in the Whisper's attitude, a gentle tug that pulled them away from their original trajectory and toward the waiting mystery of the planet's atmosphere. "Gravitational influence increasing," Goldie reported, her voice taking on the calm professionalism that marked important transitions. "We're entering Jupiter's sphere of influence, all systems responding normally." Thomas checked the external sensors, watching as the planet's powerful magnetic field began to interact with their ship's own protective fields. Jupiter's magnetosphere was vast, extending far beyond the planet itself, an invisible ocean of charged particles and electromagnetic forces that could fry unprotected electronics in seconds. The Whisper's shielding handled it easily, but the readings were still impressive. "Her magnetic field is incredible," he murmured, studying the displays. "It's like she's alive. The patterns, the way the field lines pulse and shift, it's almost organic." "Maybe she is," Goldie said softly, her eyes fixed on the growing planet ahead of them. "Alive, I mean, not in the way we understand life, but in some larger sense, to consciousness made of gravity and gas and time itself. The idea wasn't as far-fetched as it might have seemed to earlier generations of explorers. They had encountered too much in their travels to dismiss any possibility out of hand. Crystal beings that fed on starlight, gas clouds that showed signs of intentional organization, quantum entities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The universe was far stranger and more wonderful than any theory could encompass. As Jupiter's gravity took firmer hold of them, Thomas felt the familiar flutter in his stomach that came with crossing the threshold between the known and unknown. It was a feeling he had come to treasure over the years, that moment of transition when the familiar fell away and the universe opened up to reveal new wonders. The planet's magnetosphere embraced their small craft more tightly now, guiding them toward the swirling clouds with invisible hands that Thomas could feel through the ship's systems. The Whisper responded to the guidance like a dancer responding to music, her movements graceful and sure despite the immense forces at work around them. Entry in 30 seconds, Goldie announced softly. Around them, the ship's systems hummed their quiet lullabies, every component working in perfect harmony, every circuit and processor dedicated to keeping them safe in the hostile environment they were about to enter. The stars behind them began to fade as Jupiter's bulk filled their entire view, its cloud bands resolving into individual storm systems, each one a world unto itself. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and reverence that marked the beginning of every great exploration. "Whatever we find down there," he said quietly, "we face it together." "Always," Goldie replied, her hand finding his across the narrow space between their seats. "Together in wonder, together in discovery, together in whatever mysteries wait beneath those ancient clouds." Then they were falling. Chapter 2. The Outer Reaches. The first layer of atmosphere welcomed them like silk curtains parting before a gentle breeze. Wisps of high-altitude clouds streamed past their windows in ghostly ribbons, pale yellow and cream, thin as breath, delicate as spun glass. The Whisper barely trembled as she descended, her stabilizers adjusting with mechanical grace to every subtle change in the atmospheric density. "Temperature rising slowly," Goldie murmured, her voice taking on the ritualistic cadence of descent procedures, each word measured and calm. "Pressure building gradually. She's treating us gently, like honored guests arriving at a palace gate." The transition was so smooth it was almost imperceptible. One moment they were in the hard vacuum of space, the next they were surrounded by the outermost tendrils of Jupiter's atmosphere. But what atmosphere it was! Not the thin, familiar mixture of nitrogen and oxygen that cradled their birth world, but an alien soup of hydrogen and helium, ammonia and methane, compounds that would be deadly to human lungs but created beauty beyond description in their natural state. Thomas watched the altimeter's steady progression, numbers scrolling past that represented depths no human had ever explored, pressures no surface dweller had ever experienced. But his attention was caught by something else. A sound, barely audible, like wind chimes in a distant room, musical notes played on instruments that didn't quite exist. "Do you hear that?" he asked, tilting his head toward the hull, where the sound seemed to emanate from the very structure of the ship itself. Goldie paused in her monitoring, listening with the trained ear of someone who had learned to recognize the 1,000 different sounds a ship could make, each one carrying information about systems and stresses, and the health of the vessel that carried them through the void. But this was different, not mechanical, not structural, but somehow organic. The sound was there, just at the edge of perception, musical and strange, like nothing in their experience but somehow familiar nonetheless. "The atmosphere," she breathed, understanding dawning in her voice. "It's singing." As they descended deeper, the sound grew clearer, not louder, but more complex, more layered. Harmonies began to emerge from what had seemed like simple notes, melodies weaving in and out of each other like voices in a cosmic choir. It was as if the very air molecules were orchestrating some vast symphony, each particle contributing its own microscopic note to a composition that spanned the entire planet. The clouds around them began to thicken, taking on deeper hues as the sun's light filtered through increasing layers of atmosphere. The pale yellows darkened to amber,
The creams warmed to gold, creating a twilight realm that seemed to exist outside normal time. Shafts of Jupiter's distant sun pierced the vapor in golden spears, each beam creating columns of illuminated mist that rose and fell like breath made visible. "We're entering the first major cloud deck," Thomas reported, but his voice held wonder rather than mere clinical observation. The world outside had become a cathedral of mist and light, vast and solemn and beautiful beyond words. Every direction he looked revealed new structures in the clouds, arches and pillars, domes and spires, all formed by the natural flow of gases, but arranged with such precision they seemed almost intentional. Strange shapes began to move in the clouds around them, not solid, but patterns in the mist that suggested vast, slow creatures swimming through the sky. Goldie pressed closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she strained to get a better view of the phenomena unfolding around them. "Look at that," she whispered, pointing to a formation that was approaching from their starboard. A pod of what could only be called cloud whales drifted past their small craft, each one the size of a mountain, their forms shifting and flowing like living weather systems. They moved with ponderous grace, their bodies translucent, shot through with veins of lightning that pulsed in rhythm with the atmospheric song that surrounded them all. The electrical discharges weren't random, they followed patterns, traced pathways through the creatures' forms that suggested nervous systems, circulatory systems, networks of communication and coordination. "Electrical life," Thomas said softly, his scientific mind racing to categorize what he was seeing even as his sense of wonder threatened to overwhelm his analytical faculties. "Living storms, consciousness made of charged particles and magnetic fields." One of the creatures seemed to notice their small craft, turning what might have been its head, a concentration of electrical activity at the front of its massive form toward them. For a moment, Thomas felt the weight of an alien intelligence, vast and patient and utterly benign, examining them with senses that operated on frequencies beyond human perception. The creature's attention was gentle but thorough, like being observed by a cosmic whale that measured thoughts instead of distances. Then the creature sang, a deep resonant note that made the whisper's hull vibrate like a struck bell, the frequency traveling through the ship's structure and into the bones of its passengers. The note was complex, layered with harmonics that conveyed meaning without words, emotion without familiar reference points. It was a greeting, a welcome, an acknowledgement of kinship across the vast gulf that separated their forms of existence. "It's welcoming us," Goldie said, tears forming in her eyes, as the creature's song triggered emotional responses she hadn't expected. "It knows we're visitors. It knows we come in peace and wonder." Other members of the pod began to sing in response, their voices joining the first in a harmony that seemed to embrace the entire cloud layer. The music was ancient, complex, beautiful in ways that transcended species and form. It spoke of eons spent swimming through Jupiter's atmosphere, of storms weathered and territories claimed and claimed again, of a form of life that had learned to thrive in conditions that would destroy any surface-dwelling organism in seconds. Thomas found himself thinking about the vastness of life in the universe, the countless forms consciousness could take when freed from the narrow constraints of planetary surfaces. These creatures had evolved in three-dimensional space, in an environment where the very concepts of up and down were fluid, where solid matter was unknown, and existence was a dance of energy and gas and magnetic fields. "Their nervous systems," he murmured, watching the lightning patterns pulse through the nearest creature's form. "They're using electrical discharges the way we use neurons, but scaled up, distributed through volumes of space larger than cities. And they're old," Goldie added, her voice filled with respect. "Listen to their songs. Those harmonies didn't develop overnight. They've been perfecting this music for millennia." The cloud whales accompanied them for nearly an hour of descent, their massive forms providing escort through the upper reaches of Jupiter's atmosphere. They seemed curious about the small craft and its passengers, occasionally approaching close enough that Thomas and Goldie could see details of their internal structure, networks of electrical activity that pulsed and flowed like rivers of light, magnetic organs that shaped and controlled their movements through the dense gas. As the whisper descended deeper, the pressure and density increasing with every meter, the cloud whales began to fall behind. This wasn't their domain. They were creatures of the upper reaches, adapted to the thin atmosphere, and low pressure of Jupiter's outer layers. But before they departed, they sang one final song, a complex harmony that seemed to carry blessings and safe passage, a musical gift to speed the travelers on their journey into the depths. "They're saying goodbye," Goldie translated, though she couldn't have explained how she understood the meaning of the ethereal music. "And they're telling us to remember them to the deep dwellers. They're giving us a song to carry with us." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the trust that had been placed in them. They were not just explorers now, but ambassadors, carrying greetings from one layer of Jupiter's atmosphere to another, connecting communities of consciousness that were separated by pressure and distance but linked by the vast symphony of life that permeated the planet. As they left the realm of the cloud whales behind, the atmosphere around them began to change again. The pressure was increasing noticeably now, the Whisper's hull beginning to compress slightly under the growing weight of gas above them. The temperature was rising too, thermal energy building as they descended deeper into Jupiter's gravitational well. Entering the intermediate zone, Thomas announced, checking their instruments. All systems remained green, all readings within acceptable, but they were moving beyond the realm of easy retreat now. If something went wrong in the depths below, they would need to trust in the Whisper's design and their own skills to carry them through. The clouds here were different, denser, more actively turbulent. Rivers of gas flowed in visible currents, carrying clouds of different colors and compositions in streams that twisted and merged and separated again, in patterns that reminded Goldie of abstract paintings come to life. The lightning was more frequent here too, great bolts that arced between cloud masses with enough energy to power cities, creating brief moments of brilliant illumination that revealed the vast scale of the atmospheric formations around them. "It's like watching the birth of weather," she whispered, her face pressed to the window as she tried to take in the spectacle surrounding them. Every cloud, every current, every electrical discharge, they're all connected, all part of some vast atmospheric machine that's been running since the planet formed. Thomas was monitoring their descent rate, making minor adjustments to keep them on the optimal trajectory through the increasingly dense gas. But part of his attention was captured by the beauty unfolding around them, the interplay of forces that created art on a scale that dwarfed anything conceived by finite minds. The precision of it all, he mused, the way every current flows exactly where it needs to, the way the electrical activity follows patterns that seem almost intentional. It's like the entire atmosphere is conscious, aware of its own processes. "Maybe it is," Goldie replied. "Maybe consciousness isn't limited to discrete organisms. Maybe it can emerge from any sufficiently complex system, and Jupiter's atmosphere is certainly that." They descended through layers of wonder, each zone of the planet's atmosphere revealing new mysteries, new forms of organization that challenged their understanding of what life could be. In the amber depths below the cloud whale's domain, they encountered forests of crystalline formations that grew from nothing, sustained by the complex chemistry of the deep atmosphere. These crystal trees, for they could be called nothing else, swayed in currents of methane and ammonia that moved like underwater rivers through the dense gas. Each tree was unique, formed by the gradual accumulation of trace compounds over centuries, their branches reaching in all directions to catch the exotic nutrients that drifted through their realm. Lightning danced between the crystal trees in displays of blue and violet, but here the electrical activity was different from the chaotic bolts of the upper layers. This lightning was controlled, purposeful, following precise pathways that suggested cultivation rather than random discharge. The trees were farming the electricity, using it to power their growth, to communicate with their neighbors, to participate in the vast network of electrical activity that permeated Jupiter's atmosphere. A forest of living crystal, Goldie breathed, watching as one of the trees near their path pulsed with internal light, its branches shifting slightly to track their passage. "They're aware of us. They're watching." Indeed, the entire forest seemed to be responding to their presence, trees pulsing with synchronized light, electrical patterns flowing between them in waves that reminded Thomas of neural activity. The forest was thinking, communicating, perhaps even deliberating about these strange visitors who had descended from the thin places above. As they passed through the crystal canopy, the Whisper was briefly surrounded by a gentle aurora of colored light, the tree's way of greeting them, a display of welcome that painted their ship in shades of blue and green and violet. The colors flowed across the hull like water, like music made visible, creating patterns that were beautiful beyond description. They're artists too, Goldie whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Everything here is an artist. The clouds, the whales, the crystal trees, they're all creating beauty as they live. Thomas nodded, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented, an entire ecosystem of consciousness, each level adapted to different pressure and temperature conditions, but all connected by the vast symphony of electromagnetic activity that made Jupiter more than just a ball of gas. It was a living entity, a planet-sized organism with thoughts that manifested as weather patterns and dreams that took the form of crystal forests and electrical waves. But they were not yet at the deepest levels, not yet at the heart of the mystery that called to them from Jupiter's core. The pressure readings continued to climb, the temperature gauges showed steady increases, and the whisper continued her long descent into realms that no surface dweller had ever imagined, let alone explored. Chapter 3. The Realm of Pressure. The pressure's getting serious now, Thomas noted, his voice calm but alert, as he monitored the readouts that tracked their ship's structural integrity. They were deep enough now that the Whisper's hull was beginning to compress measurably, though still well within the safety margins her designers had built into every system. The atmospheric pressure outside was approaching levels that existed nowhere in the surface worlds, pressures that could crush ordinary matter into exotic states, that transformed familiar substances into forms that bore no resemblance to their surface counterparts. The clouds here were darker, richer in color than anything they had encountered in the upper reaches. Deep oranges and burgundies swirled past their windows, created by complex chemical reactions that occurred only under extreme pressure. The colors reminded Goldie of autumn on worlds where seasons changed with genuine leaves and genuine cold. But there was nothing earthly about the precipitation that began to streak their windows. It wasn't water that fell around them. Water couldn't exist in liquid form at these temperatures and pressures. Instead, droplets of liquid helium streamed past their craft, but in patterns that defied every law of physics they thought they understood. The helium rain fell upward, streaming toward Jupiter's core in reverse waterfalls of silver light that created rivers in the sky, flowing against gravity as if the very concepts of up and down had become meaningless. The temperature differential, Thomas murmured, his scientific mind working to understand the phenomenon even as his sense of wonder threatened to overwhelm his analytical faculties. Hot gases rising, cool gases sinking, but the helium, he shook his head in amazement. The pressure gradients are so intense that they're creating convection currents that flow in all directions simultaneously. Each droplet of falling helium caught and reflected the strange illumination of this deep realm light that came not from any sun, but from the friction of gases moving at tremendous speeds, from electrical discharges that operated on scales beyond imagination, from the gravitational energy of Jupiter herself as she compressed her own atmosphere into increasingly exotic forms. The result was a light show that painted the dense atmosphere in constantly shifting patterns of silver and gold, creating artificial auroras that danced through the helium rain like captured starlight. The beauty was otherworldly, stunning in its alien magnificence, a reminder that the universe contained forms of art that no surface dweller could create or even imagine. They were deep enough now that the concept of up and down had indeed become fluid, meaningless. The Whisper rode currents of dense gas that flowed in all directions, carrying them through three-dimensional landscapes that existed only in gradients of pressure and temperature, only in the slow dance of elements being compressed toward the planet's mysterious core. Navigation was becoming interesting, Goldie reported, her fingers dancing across the controls as she tried to maintain their planned descent trajectory through the chaotic currents. The gas flows are incredibly complex down here. It's like trying to sail through a three-dimensional ocean where every current flows in a different direction. The ship's sensors painted a picture of their surroundings that challenged comprehension. Layers of gas with different densities and temperatures flowing past each other like immiscible liquids, creating interfaces where the laws of fluid dynamics created phenomena that had no names in any surface language. Rivers of hot hydrogen rose through oceans of cold helium, while streams of exotic compounds flowed horizontally through both, creating a transport system that connected every part of Jupiter's deep atmosphere in an intricate web of circulation.
A disturbance in the helium rain caught Goldie's attention, a swirling pattern that seemed to move with purpose, rather than merely flowing with the chaotic currents around it. As they watched, the pattern resolved itself into a school of creatures unlike anything they had ever encountered in their 7 years of galactic wandering. Each creature was roughly the size of their ship, translucent as jellyfish, but possessed of an internal structure that pulsed with its own light. They moved through the dense atmosphere like swimmers through water, their forms contracting and expanding in perfect rhythm, propelling themselves through the pressure gradients with ethereal grace. Plasma beings, Goldie breathed, her voice filled with the wonder that never faded, no matter how many impossible things they encountered. They're feeding on the electrical differences in the atmosphere. Look at the way they orient themselves along the magnetic field lines. The creatures were indeed following the invisible pathways of Jupiter's magnetic field, using the planet's electromagnetic structure as a roadmap through the chaotic depths. Their bodies were partially ionized gas held together by magnetic forces, living lightning that had learned to maintain coherent form in the crushing depths of a gas giant's atmosphere. As the whisper passed among them, the plasma beings began to emit soft chimes, not sounds exactly, for sound, as surface dwellers understood, it couldn't travel through the exotic mixture of gases at these pressures, but electromagnetic pulses that their ship's sensors translated into musical tones. The result was an ethereal symphony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, music that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the mind. "They're curious about us too," Thomas said, watching as several of the creatures approached their craft with the cautious interest of wild animals encountering something completely outside their experience, but not afraid. "They recognize us as fellow travelers, I think." One of the plasma beings drifted closer, extending what might have been a sensory organ, a tendril of coherent energy that danced with its own internal lightning. The appendage touched the Whisper's hull with incredible delicacy, and for a moment the entire ship rang like a struck tuning fork, resonating with frequencies that spoke of curiosity, wonder, and gentle intelligence. But there was no threat in the contact, only investigation. The plasma being seemed to approve of what it found in that brief electromagnetic handshake, pulsing once with warm light that painted the surrounding atmosphere in shades of gold and amber before rejoining its companions in their eternal dance through Jupiter's depths. They're migrants, Goldie realized, watching the school's behavior patterns. They travel through the different pressure layers following food sources, energy gradients. It's hard to tell, but they're definitely moving with purpose, not just drifting. Thomas studied the creatures' movement patterns, noting how they coordinated their actions without any visible communication. "They're linked," he said, "some kind of electromagnetic network. Each individual is part of a larger collective consciousness, sharing information, sharing experience." The concept was fascinating, a school of living lightning that functioned as a distributed intelligence, each member contributing to the whole while maintaining its individual identity. It was another reminder of the infinite creativity of consciousness, the countless ways awareness could organize itself when freed from the constraints of solid matter and planetary surfaces. The plasma beings accompanied them for a time, their electromagnetic songs creating a gentle backdrop to the Whisper's descent. Their music was different from the crystal tree's electrical symphonies or the cloud whale's atmospheric harmonies. This was the sound of pure energy, given voice, of consciousness that existed at the intersection of matter and force. As they descended deeper, approaching pressure levels that began to challenge even the Whisper's advanced protective systems, the plasma beings gradually fell behind. Like the cloud whales before them, these creatures were adapted to specific atmospheric conditions, comfortable within particular ranges of pressure and temperature. But before they departed, they offered their own gift.
a pulse of pure energy that flowed through the ship's systems like a blessing, leaving every circuit slightly more efficient, every sensor slightly more sensitive. They've improved our instruments, Thomas realized, watching the displays brighten and clarify as the plasma beam's gift propagated through their equipment, given us a better connection to the electromagnetic spectrum down here. A parting gift, Goldie said softly, to help us see more clearly in the depths we're approaching. Deeper they fell, into realms where the very concepts of solid and liquid began to break down, where matter existed in states that had no names in any surface language. The pressure was immense now, measured not in familiar atmospheric units, but in values that approached those found at the cores of smaller planets. The Whisper held steady, her protective shell distributing the crushing force evenly across her structure, but the readings were impressive enough to command respect. "We're approaching the metallic hydrogen layer," Thomas announced, though his voice held none of the clinical detachment such a statement might suggest. They were about to enter a realm that existed nowhere else in the known universe, except in the hearts of gas giants and the cores of stars, a place where matter itself was transformed into forms that challenged the very definitions of solid and liquid, metal and gas. The transition was gradual, like sinking into honey that slowly became silver as they descended. The atmospheric pressure had reached levels where hydrogen, simple familiar hydrogen, was compressed beyond all earthly comprehension, forced to take on properties that seemed almost magical to minds trained in surface physics. Here in the metallic hydrogen sea, hydrogen atoms were squeezed so tightly that their electrons were stripped away, creating a fluid that conducted electricity like a metal while flowing like water. It was matter in a state that surface dwellers could barely imagine, a substance that was simultaneously familiar and completely alien. The Whisper moved through this exotic medium, like a submarine, exploring the deepest trenches of an impossible ocean. The metallic hydrogen was not transparent like the atmospheric layers above. It glowed with its own light, created by the immense pressures and electrical currents that flowed through it in patterns that spanned continents. And here in this deepest realm, they encountered the true natives of Jupiter's heart. Chapter 4: The Deep Dwellers. They appeared first as patterns in the metallic hydrogen sea, geometric shapes that pulsed with their own inner light, structures that seemed to exist at the intersection of matter and energy, consciousness and force. As Thomas and Goldie watched in growing amazement, the patterns began to organize themselves, rising from the depths like thoughts becoming real, forming complex three-dimensional structures that hung in the dense medium like living architecture. "Cities," Goldie whispered, her voice filled with awe that bordered on reverence. "They're cities, but cities built by what manner of beings?" The structures were beautiful beyond description, all flowing curves and impossible angles, constructed from materials that could not exist anywhere else in the universe. Crystallized pressure, solidified magnetism, condensed time itself. No substances from the surface worlds could survive in this deep realm, where the atmospheric pressure exceeded that found at the center of solid planets, where temperatures rose toward those found in stellar cores. Yet here, in conditions that would vaporize any known solid, entire civilizations bloomed in the crushing depths. Spires of living light rose from foundations of compressed gravity, their surfaces rippling with equations that described the fundamental forces of reality. Bridges of pure mathematics connected impossible towers, creating networks of communication that operated on principles surface science had never dreamed. The architecture itself seemed to be alive, growing and changing in response to the thoughts and needs of its inhabitants. Walls flowed like water when passage was needed, then solidified into forms stronger than diamond when structural integrity was required. Gardens of pure energy bloomed in courtyards paved with crystallized space-time, tended by beings who had learned to make art from the fundamental forces that held reality together. How long have they been here? Thomas wondered aloud, his mind struggling to comprehend the age of what they were seeing. These structures, they're not built, they're grown, evolved. They represent eons of development, millennia of refinement. The inhabitants revealed themselves slowly, emerging from their crystal palaces like thoughts becoming manifest in the physical world. They were beings of pure energy, wrapped in shells of compressed matter, their forms shifting constantly between states of existence that had no analogues in the surface worlds. Each one was unique, a living expression of the forces that shaped this deep realm, consciousness given form by will and pressure and the strange physics of Jupiter's metallic heart. As the whisper descended deeper into their realm, moving with the respectful caution of visitors in a sacred place, more of the deep dwellers emerged to observe these strange travelers from the thin places above. They approached with curiosity, but without fear, their forms gliding through the metallic hydrogen with ease that spoke of perfect adaptation to their impossible environment. "We should leave," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. The beauty around them was overwhelming, the sense of ancient wisdom and benevolent power that emanated from the deep dwellers, both humbling and comforting. "We're intruders here, outsiders in a realm we can barely comprehend." But even as he spoke, one of the beings approached their craft, and suddenly their minds were filled with communication that bypassed language entirely. Thoughts that flowed like music directly into their consciousness, without the need for words or symbols or any of the crude tools surface dwellers used to share meaning. "Welcome, travelers from the thin places above. Your journey brings light to the deep reaches, curiosity to realms that have known only their own thoughts for ages beyond counting. Rest here a while, and share the songs of the upper winds with those who have forgotten what it means to feel the touch of vacuum and starlight." The being's presence was vast but gentle, ancient beyond measure, but somehow youthful in its curiosity about these strange visitors who had descended through so many layers of atmosphere to reach the metallic depths. Its consciousness felt like an ocean, deep, calm, filled with currents of thought that ran far beneath the surface of immediate awareness. Around them, more of the deep dwellers gathered, not threatening, but protective, creating a cocoon of safety around the small ship from the far reaches of space. Their forms were hypnotic to watch, energy made manifest, consciousness given shape by forces that operated beyond the reach of surface physics. Some appeared as geometric patterns that folded through dimensions the human mind could barely perceive. Others took forms that suggested vast sea.
The Unknown Signal, Chapter 1. The First Whisper. The silence of deep space stretched endlessly around the whisper as she drifted through the void between star systems, her silver hull reflecting the distant light of a red dwarf star that had no name in any terrestrial catalogue. Thomas stood at the communication console, his weathered fingers adjusting the receiver's sensitivity, searching the electromagnetic spectrum for anything that might break the cosmic quiet that had surrounded them for 3 weeks. Still nothing from the usual frequencies, he reported to Goldie, who was tending the ship's navigation systems with the careful attention of someone who had learned that small details could mean the difference between safe harbor and endless wandering in the dark between worlds. "The commercial shipping lanes are completely silent out here. We're well beyond the reach of civilization's chatter." Goldie looked up from her work, her golden hair catching the soft blue glow of the instrument panels. Her eyes held that mixture of contentment and restless curiosity that had driven them to seek the galaxy's quieter corners, the places where mystery still held sway over explanation. "Sometimes the silence is more valuable than any message," she said, her voice carrying the peace that came from 7 years of learning to appreciate the universe's subtler communications. They were deep in the outer spiral, following rumors of an ancient star cluster where gravitational anomalies had been creating spectacular light shows, auroras that painted entire solar systems in colors that had no names. It was the kind of phenomenon that drew them like moths to flame, the promise of beauty combined with mystery, of experiences that couldn't be quantified or catalogued, but only lived. The Whisper herself seemed to appreciate these quiet moments between discoveries. Her engines maintained their gentle hum, a sound that had become as familiar as heartbeat. After 7 years of constant companionship, every surface bore the patina of long voyaging, controls worn smooth by countless touches, windows polished by careful maintenance, the 1,000 small modifications that had been made during their travels to accommodate the needs of two souls who had chosen the vast darkness as their home. Thomas returned to his monitoring, letting the receiver sweep across frequencies that surface-based astronomers rarely bothered with, the deep radio bands, where pulsars whispered their ancient secrets, the microwave ranges where the cosmic background radiation still carried echoes of the universe's birth. It was meditative work, this listening to the cosmos, requiring patience and an ear trained to distinguish between the random static of space and the purposeful signals that occasionally emerged from the void. Contact in 3 hours with the Andromedae cluster, Goldie reported, her voice taking on the professional cadence that marked important transitions. The gravitational readings are starting to show interesting patterns. Whatever's creating those auroras, it's big enough to affect space-time in measurable ways. Thomas nodded, but kept his attention focused on the communications array. Something had been nagging at him for the past hour, a sense that the cosmic background noise wasn't entirely random. It was probably nothing. Space was full of phenomena that could create patterns in electromagnetic radiation without requiring consciousness as an explanation. Solar activity, magnetic field interactions, the collision of gas clouds moving at relativistic speeds, all could create signals that seemed almost intentional to minds trained to find meaning in chaos. But as he fine-tuned the receiver, adjusting its sensitivity to catch the faintest whispers from the void, he began to hear something that made him pause. It was subtle, barely distinguishable from the random hiss of space itself, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence that suggested purpose rather than chance. "Goldie," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tension of someone who had learned to trust his instincts about the universe's stranger offerings. "Come listen to this." She moved to his side with the fluid grace that came from years of shipboard life, where every movement had to be precise to avoid the 1,000 ways a small craft could injure unwary passengers. She leaned close to the speaker, her ear trained to catch subtleties that might escape less experienced travelers. At first, there was only the familiar hiss of cosmic background radiation, the random static that filled the void between stars like audio snow. But as Thomas adjusted the filtering algorithms, the underlying pattern began to emerge, a rhythm that pulsed like a slow heartbeat, modulated in ways that spoke of intelligence, even if the language was completely unfamiliar. "It's artificial," Goldie breathed, her voice filled with the wonder that never faded, no matter how many impossible things they encountered in their travels. Something is broadcasting on this frequency, but the signal strength, it's incredibly weak. Whatever's sending it must be very far away, or very old. Thomas nodded, his fingers dancing across the controls as he tried to isolate the signal from the background noise. The pattern was complex, layered with harmonics and modulations that suggested a sophisticated understanding of information theory. But the language, if it was language, was unlike anything in their extensive database of known civilizations. "The translation algorithms can't make sense of it," he reported, frustration creeping into his voice. "The syntax doesn't match any linguistic patterns we know. It's not mathematical, not pictorial, not based on any recognizable logic structure." Goldie studied the waveform patterns displayed on their screens, her mind working through the possibilities. In 7 years of wandering, they had encountered many forms of communication, crystalline beings who spoke in frequency modulations, gas clouds that shared thoughts through electromagnetic pulses, quantum entities
that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But this was different, alien, in ways that challenged their understanding of how consciousness could express itself. "Play it again," she said softly. "Let me listen to the rhythm, the emotional undertones. Sometimes meaning exists below the level of words." Thomas reset the playback, and once again, the strange signal filled their cabin. As Goldie listened with the trained ear of someone who had learned to hear the universe's subtler communications, her expression gradually changed. The wonder remained, but it was joined by something deeper, concern, perhaps even sadness. "It's a distress call," she said finally, her voice filled with certainty that came from intuition rather than analysis. "I can't translate the words, but the tone, the rhythm, the way the signal repeats. Someone is calling for help." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the recycled air of their life support systems. A distress call from an unknown civilization, broadcast on frequencies that suggested technology far beyond anything in the explored galaxy. The implications were staggering and potentially dangerous. "The signal's directional," he said, checking their navigation computers. "It's coming from the Andromedae cluster, roughly the same area where we're detecting those gravitational anomalies." Goldie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the waveform patterns that danced across their screens, like alien music made visible. "Distance estimate." Thomas ran the calculations, factoring in signal strength, dispersion patterns, and the relativistic effects that could distort transmissions across interstellar distances. "Assuming standard broadcast power, approximately 47 light-years. But given the signal's complexity and the power requirements for that range, whoever's sending it has access to energy sources we can barely imagine." 47 light-years, Goldie repeated softly. "Even if we could respond, by the time our answer reached them, whatever crisis prompted the distress call would be long resolved, one way or another." But Thomas could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between practical considerations and the deeper impulses that had driven them to spend 7 years exploring the galaxy's mysteries. They were not rescue workers, not equipped for military operations or disaster relief. The Whisper was a vessel built for observation and discovery, for the quiet exploration of phenomena that challenged understanding. Yet the signal continued to pulse from their speakers, its alien rhythm carrying an emotional weight that transcended language barriers. Someone, something, was in desperate need, calling across the void for aid that might never come. The thought of ignoring such a plea went against everything they had learned about consciousness and its fundamental responsibility to other forms of awareness. "We could at least investigate," Thomas said finally. "If nothing else, we might be able to relay the signal to someone better equipped to respond. The Commonwealth has ships in the outer sectors, exploration vessels with the range and resources for long-distance rescue operations." Goldie nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. "There's something else," she said, studying the frequency analysis more carefully. "The signal isn't just a distress call. There's another component, a secondary transmission embedded in the main broadcast." Thomas leaned closer, watching as she isolated the secondary signal from the primary distress beacon. The hidden transmission was even fainter than the main signal, barely distinguishable from random noise. But as the computer enhanced and clarified it, another pattern began to emerge. This signal was different, not the rhythmic pulse of a distress beacon, but something more complex, more nuanced. It carried data streams that suggested detailed information about location, circumstances, perhaps even the nature of whatever crisis had prompted the original call for help. "It's a data packet," Thomas realized, his scientific mind racing to categorize the new information. Whoever sent the distress call also included technical specifications, star charts, possibly even cultural information to help potential rescuers understand what they're dealing with. But as the translation algorithms worked to decode the embedded data, they encountered the same barriers that had frustrated their attempts to understand the primary signal. The information was organized according to principles that didn't match any known system, encoded in formats that challenged their most sophisticated analytical tools. "We're going to need more processing power," Goldie said, studying the preliminary analysis, "and more time. This isn't something we can decode while drifting in open space." Thomas checked their position relative to the Andromedae cluster, calculating approach vectors and arrival times. 6 days at current speed, he reported. "We could set course now, begin the journey, while we work on decoding the signals. Even if we can't provide direct assistance, we might learn enough to guide others who can." "And if it's a trap?" Goldie asked, voicing the concern that shadowed every deep space explorer's thoughts. "Unknown technology, alien psychology, a signal designed to lure curious travelers into danger." It was a valid worry. The galaxy was vast enough to contain forms of consciousness that operated on principles completely foreign to human understanding. What seemed like a distress call to their minds might be something else entirely: a hunting lure, a territorial warning, or simply communication so alien that their interpretation was completely wrong. But as they listened to the signal again, Thomas felt the same intuitive certainty that had guided them through 7 years of successful exploration. The emotional undertones that Goldie had identified were real, unmistakable despite the language barriers. Whatever was broadcasting that signal was genuinely in distress, genuinely calling for aid across the cosmic void. "We go carefully," he said finally. "Full passive sensors, no active scanning, until we understand what we're dealing with. If there's any sign of danger, we back off and call for Commonwealth assistance." Goldie smiled, that radiant expression that could warm the coldest void between galaxies. "When have we ever chosen the safe path?" she said, echoing words she had spoken countless times over the years. "Besides, someone needs help. How can we turn away from that?" Thomas began plotting their course toward the Andromedae cluster, making the minute adjustments to their trajectory that would carry them toward the source of the mysterious signal. As the Whisper's engines adjusted to their new heading, he felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that marked the beginning of every great exploration. Behind them, the red dwarf star continued its ancient dance through the void, indifferent to the small drama playing out in its vicinity. Ahead lay the unknown, a civilization in distress, technology beyond current understanding, and mysteries that would challenge everything they thought they knew about consciousness and communication in the vastness of space. The signal continued to pulse from their speakers as they accelerated toward their destination, its alien rhythm gradually becoming as familiar as their own heartbeats. 47 light-years away, someone was waiting, hoping, perhaps dying while they struggled to cross the vast distances that separated star from star. But they were coming, slowly, carefully, but inevitably. The Whisper carried her crew toward whatever waited in the Andromedae cluster, toward a mystery that would test their understanding of life, consciousness, and the bonds that connected all aware beings across the infinite reaches of space. Chapter 2: The Long Decode. For 3 days, as the Whisper accelerated toward the Andromedae cluster, Thomas and Goldie worked in shifts to decode the mysterious signals that continued to pulse from their communications array. The task was unlike anything they had attempted before, not simply a matter of translation, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of how consciousness could encode meaning in electromagnetic radiation. "The mathematical structures are fascinating," Thomas reported during one of their regular briefings, his voice carrying the mix of excitement and frustration that marked intensive research. "The signal uses prime number sequences, but not in any pattern we recognize. It's as if they've discovered mathematical relationships that our science hasn't even conceived of yet." Goldie looked up from her own analysis, her golden hair disheveled from hours spent hunched over the signal processing equipment. She had been working on the emotional and rhythmic aspects of the transmission, trying to understand the consciousness behind the mathematics. "The harmonics are definitely intentional," she said, her voice thoughtful. "There are emotional overtones embedded in the frequency modulations, not just information, but feelings. Fear, certainly, but also hope, determination. It's hard to be sure without understanding the species' psychological baseline." They had isolated 17 distinct components within the signal complex, each one apparently serving a different function. The primary distress beacon was the most obvious, its rhythmic pulse designed to attract attention across interstellar distances. But layered beneath it were data streams that carried star charts, technical specifications, and what appeared to be cultural information about the signal's originators. "Look at this," Thomas said, highlighting a particularly complex section of the transmission. "This appears to be a star chart, but it's based on gravitational resonances rather than visual markers. They're mapping space-time itself, using the gravitational signatures of stellar objects as reference points." The implications were staggering. Any civilization capable of such precise gravitational mapping would possess technology far beyond anything in the explored galaxy. They would be able to navigate space-time with an accuracy that made conventional star charts seem primitive by comparison. "And this section," Goldie added, pointing to another data stream, "appears to be biological information, atmospheric requirements possibly, or physiological data that would help rescuers understand what they're dealing with." The biological data was particularly challenging to interpret. The underlying assumptions about chemistry and metabolism were clearly different from anything in their databases. The beings who had sent the signal appeared to exist in environments that would be hostile to most known forms of life: high radiation levels, extreme temperatures, atmospheric compositions that would be toxic to the majority of spacefaring species. "They're not like us," Thomas said quietly, studying the physiological requirements embedded in the signal. "Not like any of the species we've encountered. Their biology is based on principles that challenge our understanding of what life can be." But as they worked to decode more of the signal, a clearer picture began to emerge of the civilization behind the transmission. They were clearly technologically advanced, possessed of science that in some areas exceeded anything in the Commonwealth's databases. But they were also beings with emotional lives, capable of fear and hope, and a kind of desperation that drove them to send distress calls across the void. "The cultural information is the most interesting part," Goldie observed, highlighting sections of the signal that contained what appeared to be artistic expressions, patterns of modulation that carried aesthetic meaning rather than practical data. "They're not just asking for help, they're trying to communicate who they are, what makes their civilization worth preserving." The artistic components of the signal were hauntingly beautiful when translated into visual or audio formats. Abstract patterns that suggested vast cities of crystalline architecture, musical structures that spoke of harmony between technology and nature, mathematical poems that described the joy of consciousness contemplating its own existence. These beings, whatever their physical form, shared the fundamental drive to create beauty and meaning that seemed to characterize all advanced civilizations. But beneath the cultural richness and technological sophistication, the distress signal's core message remained unchanged. Someone was in terrible danger, calling across the void for assistance that might never come. On the fourth day of their journey, as the gravitational anomalies of the Andromedae cluster began to register on their long-range sensors, they finally achieved a breakthrough in their decoding efforts. The key came not from their translation algorithms, but from Goldie's intuitive understanding of the signal's emotional undertones. "It's not just one civilization," she announced during their morning briefing, her voice filled with the excitement of discovery. The signal contains at least 3 distinct linguistic patterns, 3 different approaches to encoding meaning. We're dealing with an alliance, possibly even a confederation of different species. Thomas studied the new analysis, seeing the patterns that had eluded him during his more technical approach to the problem. An interspecies alliance, he mused, that would explain the complexity of the signal structure. Each species is contributing their own expertise to the transmission. The revelation changed everything about their understanding of what awaited them in the Andromedae cluster. They weren't approaching a single species in distress, but potentially an entire civilization composed of multiple forms of consciousness working together in harmony. The cultural implications were staggering, and the potential danger if their alliance was facing a threat capable of challenging such technological sophistication. The technical specifications made more sense now, Goldie continued, highlighting different sections of the signal. Each species is providing different types of information. One appears to specialize in gravitational engineering, another in biological systems, a third in what might be quantum mechanics applications. As they studied the multi-species signal more carefully, patterns began to emerge that suggested the nature of the crisis facing the Alliance. References to stellar instability, to gravitational anomalies that were disrupting local space-time, to evacuation procedures and emergency relocations. The picture that emerged was of a civilization facing a cosmic disaster, possibly the collapse of their home star, or some other astronomical event that threatened their entire system. The timestamps are critical, Thomas realized, studying the chronological markers embedded in the signal. If I'm interpreting these correctly, they've been broadcasting for approximately 18 months, local time. Whatever's happening to them, it's a slow developing crisis, not an immediate emergency. But it's getting worse, Goldie added, pointing to subtle changes in the signal's emotional undertones over time. The earliest transmissions are concerned, but optimistic. The more recent ones show increasing desperation. They're running out of time. The knowledge that they were approaching a slowly unfolding disaster added urgency to their journey, but also raised difficult questions about their capabilities. The Whisper was not equipped for major rescue operations or disaster relief. If the Alliance was facing something like stellar collapse, there was little that 2 explorers in a small research vessel could accomplish beyond observing and reporting. But as they continued to decode the signal, they discovered another component that changed their understanding once again. Hidden within the deepest layers of the transmission was what appeared to be a plea, not for physical rescue, but for something more fundamental, for their knowledge and culture to be preserved, for their achievements to be remembered, even if their civilization itself could not be saved. It's a cultural archive, Thomas breathed, his voice filled with awe as the true scope of the transmission became clear. The entire signal is a library, a repository of their species' greatest achievements. They're not just calling for rescue, they're trying to ensure that something of their civilization survives, even if they don't. The archive contained artistic works, scientific theories, philosophical treatises, historical records, the accumulated wisdom of multiple species working together over millennia. It was a treasure trove of knowledge that would expand understanding of consciousness and civilization in ways that couldn't be measured. We have to preserve this, Goldie said urgently. Whatever happens when we reach them, this knowledge has to survive. It's not just a distress signal, it's their legacy, their gift to whatever forms of consciousness they encounter in the universe. Thomas nodded, understanding the magnitude of what they had discovered. They were not just responding to a rescue call, they were being entrusted with the cultural heritage of an entire alliance of species, the responsibility to ensure that their achievements would not be lost to the cosmic darkness. As the Whisper continued toward the Andromedae cluster, its crew worked with renewed purpose to decode and preserve every aspect of the mysterious signal. They were no longer merely explorers investigating an unknown phenomenon. They had become guardians of knowledge, protectors of consciousness and culture in the face of cosmic disaster. The signal continued to pulse from their speakers, but now they heard it with new understanding. It was not just a cry for help across the void, but a bridge between civilizations, a connection that transcended the barriers of distance and biology and language, to unite all forms of consciousness in the shared struggle against entropy and extinction. 2 days from their destination, they would learn whether they could offer more than just witness to the crisis that awaited them. But already, they had succeeded in the most important mission of all, ensuring that the achievements of the Alliance would survive, would be shared with other forms of consciousness throughout the galaxy, would add their unique voice to the great conversation of awareness that stretched across the stars.
Chapter 3. The Andromedae Approach. The Andromedae cluster revealed itself gradually as the whisper approached, first as a subtle distortion in the star patterns ahead, then as increasingly obvious gravitational lensing that bent light around massive objects hidden in the interstellar medium. Thomas stood at the observation deck, his weathered hands pressed against the cool, transparent aluminum, watching space itself warp and flex under the influence of forces that challenged his understanding of physics. The gravitational anomalies are stronger than we predicted, he reported to Goldie, who was monitoring their approach from the navigation console. Whatever's causing them, it's operating on a scale that affects the fundamental structure of space-time in this entire region. The cluster contained 47 star systems arranged in what had initially appeared to be a natural gravitational grouping, but as they drew closer, it became clear that the arrangement was anything but natural. The stars had been moved, positioned according to some vast design that created resonance patterns in the local gravitational field. It was engineering on an astronomical scale, the kind of project that would require the combined efforts of multiple civilizations working in harmony across millennia. Stellar engineering, Goldie breathed, her voice filled with awe as she studied the sensor readings. They've repositioned entire star systems to create some kind of, a gravitational computer, an energy collection matrix. The power requirements alone would exceed anything in our theoretical frameworks. The distress signal was stronger now, no longer the faint whisper they had detected in the depths of space, but a clear transmission that dominated several frequency bands. As they approached the signal's point of origin, additional details became visible that had been lost in the background noise at interstellar distances. Multiple transmitters, Thomas observed, studying the signal analysis. The transmission is being broadcast simultaneously from at least 12 different locations throughout the cluster. They're using the entire system as a communications array. But something was wrong with the perfect symmetry of the stellar arrangement. As their sensors reached their maximum resolution, they began to detect signs of instability in the gravitational matrix. Several stars were showing orbital perturbations, drifting away from their designed positions in ways that suggested the failure of whatever technology had placed them there originally. The system is breaking down, Goldie realized, her voice carrying the weight of understanding. Whatever disaster prompted their distress call, it's affecting their ability to maintain the stellar positioning. The entire gravitational structure is beginning to collapse. The implications were staggering. If the Alliance had repositioned 47 star systems to create their gravitational matrix, the energy release from its collapse would be visible across several galactic sectors. Planets would be flung into interstellar space, entire civilizations would be destroyed, and the gravitational waves from such an event would disrupt navigation and communication across a significant portion of the galaxy. We need to be very careful about our approach vector, Thomas said, calculating safe passage routes through the increasingly unstable gravitational field. If we're caught in the wrong position, when one of those stars breaks free from its orbital constraints, he didn't need to finish the thought. The Whisper's protective systems were advanced, but they were designed for the hazards of normal space travel, not for the catastrophic forces that would be unleashed by the collapse of a stellar engineering project on this scale. As they drew closer to the cluster's center, they began to detect artificial structures that had been invisible at greater distances, massive constructions that spanned the space between star systems, collectors that gathered energy from stellar radiation and focused it through networks of what appeared to be crystallized space-time. The technology was beyond anything in their experience, but its purpose was becoming clear. The Alliance had been attempting to stabilize their gravitational matrix, to prevent the very collapse that was now accelerating around them. Emergency protocols, Goldie announced as their sensors detected rapid changes in the local gravitational field. One of the outer stars is beginning to break orbit. We have approximately 6 hours before the gravitational waves reach us. Thomas adjusted their course to avoid the worst effects of the stellar displacement, but he knew that they were now committed to their approach. Turning back would require them to traverse the same unstable gravitational field they were currently navigating, and the window for safe retreat was closing rapidly. We continue, he decided, his voice calm despite the magnitude of the forces surrounding them. If the Alliance is still operational, they may be able to provide guidance through the instabilities. If not, we document what we can and get the information to someone who might be able to help. As they penetrated deeper into the cluster, they began to receive new signals, not the broad-spectrum distress call they had been tracking, but targeted transmissions directed specifically at their ship. Someone had detected their approach and was attempting to communicate directly with them. "They know we're here," Goldie reported, her voice filled with mixture of excitement and concern. "The new signals are using our own communication protocols, somehow derived from our ship's electromagnetic signature. They're adapting their transmission methods to match our technology." The targeted communications were clearer than the original distress signal, partly because they were being generated much closer to their position, but also because the Alliance was now tailoring their transmissions for human comprehension. The translation algorithms that had struggled with the original signal began to make progress with these new messages. "Welcome, travelers from the distant reaches. Your approach brings hope to those who had begun to despair of rescue. We are the confluence of harmonious minds, representatives of 7 species, united in purpose and understanding. Our stellar matrix faces imminent collapse, but your presence suggests that knowledge of our achievements may survive even if our physical forms cannot." The formal nature of the communication was striking. Despite facing cosmic disaster, the Alliance maintained the courtesy and precision that spoke of high civilization. But beneath the diplomatic language, Thomas and Goldie could hear the desperation that had driven them to broadcast across interstellar distances. "Our time grows short," the message continued. "The gravitational anchors that maintain our stellar positions are failing faster than our repair efforts can restore them. We estimate complete system collapse within the next planetary rotation cycle, but your arrival offers opportunity for cultural exchange that we had not dared hope for." "They're not asking for rescue," Thomas realized, studying the translated message carefully. "They understand that we're not equipped for that kind of operation. They're asking for something else, for contact, for the chance to share what they've learned before their civilization ends." Goldie was monitoring the approach vectors that the Alliance was transmitting, guidance that would allow them to reach the cluster's central system safely, despite the gravitational instabilities. "They're guiding us to a meeting point," she reported, "coordinates that should remain stable, even as the outer stars continue to drift." The meeting point was located in the cluster's central system, where the primary star was surrounded by artificial structures that dwarfed anything in their experience. Rings of crystalline construction that circled the star at various distances, each one apparently designed to harvest and focus stellar energy on a massive scale. Between the rings, smaller structures that might have been habitats or research facilities orbited in complex patterns that created their own gravitational harmonies. "It's beautiful,"
Goldie whispered as the full scope of the Alliance's achievements became visible. They've turned their entire solar system into a work of art, a balance between technology and natural forces that creates harmony on an astronomical scale. But even the central system showed signs of the disaster that was overtaking the cluster. Several of the crystalline rings showed stress fractures, damage that suggested they were no longer able to handle the energy flows they had been designed to manage. The orbital patterns of the smaller structures were becoming irregular as the gravitational matrix that maintained their positions continued to degrade. Incoming transmission, Thomas announced as they approached the coordinates the Alliance had provided. This one's different. It's coming from multiple sources simultaneously, as if several beings are speaking in unison. The new message carried voices, not human voices, but recognizably the product of conscious minds attempting to communicate across the barriers of biology and language. The translation was clearer now, aided by the Alliance's growing understanding of human communication patterns. Welcome to our home, brave travelers. We are honored by your presence in our final hours. I am Resonance of Deep Harmonies, speaker for the gravitational engineers. I am Whisper of Quantum Dreams, voice of the biological symbionts. I am Echo of Mathematical Truth, representative of the computational minds. We speak as one in greeting you. The formal introductions continued as more voices joined the chorus, each representing a different species within the Alliance. Thomas counted at least 12 distinct vocal patterns, suggesting that the Confederation was even larger and more diverse than their earlier analysis had indicated. Our stellar matrix was designed to create perfect gravitational harmony, the voices explained, a balance between natural forces and conscious intent that would allow our civilizations to flourish indefinitely. For 3,000 of your years, we have maintained this balance, learned from it, created art and science that expanded our understanding of existence itself. 3,000 years, Thomas murmured, his mind struggling to comprehend the scope of such a project. They've been working together for 3 millennia, creating something unprecedented in known space. But consciousness, no matter how advanced, cannot master all variables, the Alliance continued. A quantum fluctuation in the galactic dark matter distribution has created resonances we did not anticipate. Our anchoring systems, designed for stability over cosmic timescales, are failing under stresses that our theories could not predict. The explanation continued in technical detail that pushed the limits of their translation algorithms, but the basic situation was clear. The Alliance had created something unprecedented and beautiful, but forces beyond their control were now destroying it. They faced the choice between evacuation and extinction, between preserving their physical existence or maintaining the civilization they had spent millennia building. We have chosen to remain, the voices said with calm dignity that transcended species barriers. Our evacuation fleets could preserve some percentage of our populations, but they would carry only fragments of what we have built together. Better to ensure that our knowledge survives complete than to scatter incomplete pieces across the galaxy. They're choosing to go down with their creation, Goldie said softly, her voice filled with respect for the Alliance's decision. Rather than abandon what they've built, they're using their final time to preserve it in transmittable form. Your arrival provides opportunity we had not expected, the Alliance continued. We can offer you direct download of our cultural archives, scientific achievements, artistic expressions, the complete record of our Confederation's existence. But more than data, we can offer direct mental contact, consciousness to consciousness exchange that will preserve not just our knowledge, but our perspective on existence itself. The offer was extraordinary and potentially dangerous. Direct mental contact with alien consciousness carried risks that were difficult to calculate, but it also offered an opportunity for understanding that transcended any form of communication they had previously experienced. We accept, Thomas said without hesitation, speaking for both of them with the confidence that came from 7 years of partnership. We're honored to receive your trust. As the whisper approached the final coordinates, Thomas and Goldie prepared themselves for contact with minds that had spent 3 millennia working together in harmony, creating wonders that challenged the very definitions of what civilization could achieve. They were about to become the inheritors of a legacy that spanned multiple species and thousands of years, a responsibility that would change them forever. Chapter 4: The Confluence of Minds. The docking facility that received the Whisper was a masterpiece of engineering that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. As their ship was drawn into the crystalline structure by gravitational fields so precisely controlled they felt like gentle hands, Thomas and Goldie found themselves surrounded by architecture that challenged their understanding of what solid matter could be. The walls are translucent, but they're not transparent, Goldie observed, studying the structure around them as the docking procedure completed itself with mechanical precision that somehow felt organic. It's as if they're made of crystallized light, solid enough to contain atmosphere, but permeable to certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. The atmosphere that filled their temporary berth was breathable for humans, but it carried scents and harmonics that spoke of alien biology. Not unpleasant, but definitely other combinations of chemical signatures that their olfactory systems couldn't quite categorize. Sounds that might have been music, or might have been the natural resonances of the crystalline structures around them. "Welcome aboard, Harmony of Spheres," came the mental voice that had become familiar during their approach. "We have prepared chambers that should be comfortable for your physiology. The direct exchange we discussed can begin whenever you feel ready." The mental communication was different from the transmitted messages they had received earlier. This was thought-to-thought contact, consciousness touching consciousness across the barriers of biology and distance. It was intimate in ways that Thomas and Goldie hadn't expected, carrying not just information but emotional undertones, cultural assumptions, and a kind of background awareness that normally remained private within individual minds. "Do not be concerned by the intimacy of contact," the voice assured them, responding to thoughts they hadn't consciously expressed. "We are experienced in interspecies mental exchange. Your privacy will be respected, your individual identity preserved. We seek only to share knowledge, not to merge consciousness." As they prepared to leave the Whisper and enter the alien facility, Thomas felt a moment of uncertainty about abandoning their ship in an environment they didn't fully understand. But the Alliance's mental presence was deeply reassuring, carrying undertones of wisdom, compassion, and a kind of patient intelligence that came from millennia of peaceful cooperation. "The environmental seals are perfect," he reported to Goldie as they checked their portable life support systems. "Whatever technology they're using to maintain atmosphere, it's precise enough to accommodate our specific physiological requirements without any apparent effort." The corridors beyond their docking berth were populated by beings that defied easy description. The Alliance members they encountered moved with fluid grace that suggested adaptation to variable gravity environments, their forms shifting between states that might have been energy, matter, or something that existed at the intersection of both. One being that approached them appeared to be composed entirely of geometric patterns that folded through dimensions their eyes couldn't quite follow. The gravitational engineer, resonance of deep harmonies, whose mental voice they had heard during the approach. Another seemed to exist as a cloud of microorganisms that maintained coherent shape through some form of biological cooperation. Whisper of quantum dreams, representative of the symbiont species. "Your curiosity about our physical forms is natural and welcome." Resonance of deep harmonies communicated, its geometric patterns shifting in ways that suggested amusement. "We are as fast